Hey, Planeswalkers, Mithras here. Hope you're doing well and staying safe. Today is one of my favorite days, and many of you know that if you follow my content or have been watching my videos. So we are doing a tier list, but today is an expanded tier list because we did one about 2 weeks ago. We're also going to do best of 3 again, so stay tuned for the best of 1 decks as well, because that will be coming your way soon. But we also have gone through a lot of different trends, lots of observations that we'll have to cover. Obviously, the big one being a post-Omnath ban. So hang tight. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then additionally, along with that tier list, we're going to take a high-level view at each of those 20 decks as well. Obviously, you have access to all of them because it is my content that I've put together for you as well. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But before we do so, as always, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate your support. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel down over there. Additionally, if you do like the video, please go ahead and like it. You can also like me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter and Twitch to stay up to date on content like this. And stay tuned for that best of 1 tier list coming your way. So first off, for those of you that are new, what is a tier list, or what does it mean, or why does it matter? Well, first off, a tier list is here to help you kind of stack rank the decks in terms of Magic. So those being at the top, or those that we'll see here in a moment on the screen working left to right kind of, those will be the more powerful decks in terms of their relativeness to each other, as well as other decks within the arena that you may face. So lots of things to consider, lots of very, very importance in terms of video gaming. It helps give you an idea of relative strength, or if you kind of go through like a ELO type thing, the propensity that one deck is more likely to beat the other deck, as well as beat the other decks around it. So hopefully that gives you an idea for those of you that are new what a tier list is. Additionally, we'll go check it out here in a second, but we will talk about the observations, and then we'll also deep dive into those decks. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into it here. Very excited. As many of you know, this content takes me a good long time to pull together, and I absolutely enjoy doing it for you. So here's what we have going on. Again, I talked about this expanded list in terms of 20. So we'll run through it relatively quickly. The list is available for you down below, so you have access to it right away. There are links to each of the videos there for you for each of these decks. Additionally, deck links, and then you can copy and paste them. So each of those videos will have gameplay. They'll also have a deep dive in terms of the explanation, mechanics of the deck, and some of those strategies, as well as a guide for you. So here's what we got going on. We have Selesnya Yorion at the tier 1. We also have another Yorion deck, Azorius Blink. And closing off and rounding off tier 1, we have Dimir Rogues. In tier 2, we have Gruul Adventures. We also have Esper Doom, Rakdos Midrange, Mono Red, Mono Green, Mono White. We have our favorite Boros to your cycling now, Mono White Aggro, Golgari Adventures, Lurrus Mill. Naya Winata is starting off our tier 3. We have Grixis Lurrus Control in tier 3, Selesnya counters, Izzet Tempo, and then finally to round off the bottom here we have Orzhov Aggro and Jeskai Spells. So lots of things going on. Again, these are a lot of decks, some pulling through in terms of the post-ban meta as well. Some of those key pieces in terms of observations there is definitely a shift around, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But that again is the list for you. It is available, like I said, down below in the descriptions. If you do have questions or comments, obviously please ask. I'm always happy to kind of talk about that. But I definitely want to spend a few minutes here talking with you about the observations that I've noticed within the meta. Additionally, before we cover some of those things, some of the key callouts here, we saw Dimir Rogues move into that tier 1 space. There isn't necessarily a tier of its own anymore. And then we do have a couple up and newcomers here that we'll talk about here in a second. Additionally, we saw Mono Red Aggro begin to get a little bit stronger and more defined within the meta, moving out of that tier 3 previously. I know many of you commented that you thought maybe it was a tier 2 prior. But again, it just was not strong enough earlier on. I think now with where the meta is placed, that's another call out just to keep in mind there as well. And then the other one that I do think is very important to call it is Esper Doom. It's definitely risen up further. It possibly, if I recall, was maybe a tier 3, now towards the higher end of tier 2. Again, with some of the change in the meta and the broader stroke and brush that we have going on in terms of decks, tends to play fairly well against a lot of other types of things there. And then obviously relative to the meta as well that we talked about, or the list that we have here. So lots of key things to keep in mind, lots of trends, lots of change. Obviously we lost with Omnath, we lost the Omnath decks, and then we also lost the traditional Temur Clover deck as well. So those are no more. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of these trends. Pardon me as I kind of read through some of my notes too, because I do spend a lot of time, as I mentioned, trying to think through this and put this together for you. So first off, the biggest thing that we have to consider is that in terms of the meta, I still feel like it's slightly wide open. At a minimum, it's definitely still shifting around. So we've seen an influx of things coming out of different tournaments like Red Bull initially with that Rakdos mid-range. We saw that top 8 and obviously the emergency ban coming with the Omnath, which has definitely exploded and allowed for massive deck diversity and the current healthy state of standard that we do have today, which is absolutely wonderful. I do believe that this is going to represent a nice shift in the meta. So originally out of the gate, we were pretty heavy in some of those mid-range decks prior to the Omnath ban. Now we're seeing a lot of the Yorion decks creep up in terms of Selesnya here and Blink, which have been extremely popular top-rated decks, but that fares really well against the mid-range decks. However, they don't fare as well against a lot of the aggro stuff at times. So I do feel like there may be a spot where we continue to see some more of these aggro decks. We do obviously have Dimmer Rogues here still as a piece in there that is kind of a decent aggro deck in terms of the mill, and then obviously the rogue components there too. The Banhammer obviously came. We lost Omnath. We lost the split outs of the Omnath. And then we lost the Temur Clover, which allowed for this really healthy meta. The decks going into that ban that were untouched and unscathed are still very strong. So things like the Rakdos mid-range are still around, or they got stronger. So we already covered some of those trade-offs with Mono Red and Esper Doom. And then additionally, the other call out here is just in general the Gruul Adventures one as well, because that was already top 8. It's a pretty powerful deck still, very quick, and the draw heavy engines are very important. Now another piece coming out of this that is up for consideration and note is just adventures in general. So we've seen a much broader rise in that component and mix, typically with the green piece there for that getting access to Innkeeper, the draws, and then also a lot of times it gets paired with Great Henge. So we've seen that rise of the Golgari Adventures as well, and there are components within Selesnya that I've seen played. So lots of interesting things for us to consider. The other thing that I did mention that I think is very important here is just the fact that I call it Yorion flying high once again. So Yorion is definitely back in the mix. They're not going away. Definitely some top decks here. Again, as I mentioned, there's been this shift towards this much further late game style play. I mean, you could consider Omnath to be somewhat late game, but it had very powerful ramp components and the ability to scale very fast. Now we're seeing still a little bit more powerful decks, but they do take a little bit longer to get there. The next piece that I like to talk about is just there is so much diversity right now within the meta, within standard. It is a beautiful place. Allows for a lot of options, a lot of times for us to play different components. I've seen jokingly, and I shouldn't joke about this because I do believe in jank. I do believe in brewing your own decks. I think it's important, and I also believe that you can always be very competitive. in particular to this meta, though, we have seen the rise of a lot of interesting, what I'll just say, one-off decks, and just due to the nature that we have the ability to share, just like me sharing with you these different decks or talking about these tier lists, we now have a more powerful platform to talk about some of these things and cover decks like that. So I do have more of those in line and coming up as well, so stay tuned for those. The other thing that I want to talk about here is what I call influence heavy putting up the results. So again, we've seen some pretty significant tournaments over the last couple of weeks. Again, whether it was the Red Bull tournament, the Magic 2020 here kind of closure for the season deal, with the Omnath emergency ban, and then again with last weekend's kind of Channel Fireball Pro Showdown that led to this rise in these Yorion decks. It was still kind of there, but Selesnya Yorion in particular, which I really think is a great deck. It's very smooth, and I've really enjoyed piloting it for you as well. And then also thank you to everyone, as that was one of my most watched videos, and definitely got a lot of great feedback about that, so appreciate it. One thing that I do want to point out is there are a lot of choices. Obviously, you guys have seen this expanded list grow to 20. I think I got another list right now of about 10 that I plan on producing for you, and that's going to continue to change, and I expect it to change quite a bit. However, just don't go, my advice is don't get the analysis paralysis where you're seeing all these decks. There's too many choices to figure out what to play. I think, I always say this, even to the tier 3 decks, and again, obviously talking about the jank. You can pick these and they're going to perform, and I think you can definitely get to Mythic. A lot of it is just spending the time learning the intricacies of the deck, the different scenarios that you're going to run into and how you need to play around those. There's a lot of things that I still miss when I cover these decks for you, and I love it when you guys jump in and say, hey, that you should have been thinking about this or thinking about that, or you missed this piece. So I do really appreciate that as well. Sorry, I'm going to adjust my sound there. So keep that in mind. I think it's important to kind of pick one and stick to it. And with that said, though, I do want to say, rest assured, it's not you, it's me. And jokingly, this is really about the meta. So right now, I've heard many players talk about being challenged in terms of hitting Mythic. I know you guys have seen that, I'm not quite there. I do hope and plan to make it before the end of the season. And again, a lot of it has to do with showcasing a lot of these decks and just time. But I really believe that those of you that hit Mythic post-ban, or didn't play Omnath, kind of a thing, you should definitely pat yourselves on the shoulders. I think this is one of the most competitive standards right now due to the diversity of the decks, and I think it's a good thing. I think it's healthy. So again, for those of you that have been a multi-month Mythic player, last few months Mythic player, or trying to get to Mythic, it is a very tough field out there, and just due to the nature. But again, that represents a really nice portion. We don't have that 80%, 70% consolidation at Omnath. I think a lot of these decks maybe represent anywhere, I think the most I've seen is maybe 15 to 20% tops, but lots of disparity, anywhere from a couple percentage points to 10 percentage points of the meta, which is really important because you want to play a deck that's going to be able to address a lot of those things. And then additionally, for those of us that are playing in the different tiers, there is a different meta that I always talk about that you hit across each of those tiers. All right, the next thing that I do want to talk about here, and finally, to kind of round out these observations, and then we'll go ahead and talk about the kind of high level dives of each of these decks, is really we're going to be to be continued, and I say that in a meaningful way in terms of we've gone through the Euro bans, we've gone through the Omnath bans. I think there's, as I mentioned previously, there's room for a lot more decks. I got a lot more to cover. I think things are going to change. I think things are going to shift. You know, I'm very interested in the results coming in. Like I mentioned, show me the results of this weekend's events. I think that there could be the potential of another deck that's going to kind of come out of nowhere that could really, really have an impact on standard for us. So this is a very, very exciting time. I know many of us talk about it. Please enjoy it, because as in all things, it's only a fleeting moment. It may be tough, it may be hard, especially if you're competitive, but again, rest assured, it's not you, it's me. So Planeswalkers, stay tuned. Quickly, before we go ahead and take a look at some of these high-level dives, I just want to say thank you, as always. I truly appreciate being on this journey with you, and appreciate the community that we're building. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel down over there to stay up to date on content like this. Additionally, feel free to like the video if you do enjoy it. You can like me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter and Twitch as well to stay up to date on this kind of content or deck lists, or what have you, in terms of other things that I do plan on rolling out here around new joiners and all that. So, all right, Planeswalkers, that concludes the observations piece. We've gone through the tier list. We've gone through the observations and the trends, which I think is always important. We are now going to go ahead and look at each of these decks at a high level here. Again, the list is available for you down below, so you have access to it. You have access to all the decks, like I mentioned. If you want a deeper dive or understand some other pieces, definitely check those out. There's lots of gameplay for you. And then lastly, if you have questions, please ask. I do my best to try and respond. I think many of you in the community know that. So please feel free. I'm here to help. All right, so let's see what we got going on here. So we're going to start in Tier 1 with our Selesnya Yorion deck. Here, the component and the key pieces, again, is Yorion, but it's all about the blink components. So Selesnya is the green and white color components. Each things here really feed in terms of control or food to really get us moving with things like Skyclave to shut down our opponents, or Wicked Wolf to pick things off. We have Elspeth Conquers Death as well for the higher end of the curve, and then our favorite Yorion here. Here's the sideboard for you as well. Quickly, lots of good options for us. And then finally here, one of my favorites, Kogla the Titan Ape. A great loop that you can run with bouncing things like Charming Prince back and forth as well. So lots of things to pay attention to. Definitely a top deck right now, up and coming and rising, so pay attention. Next we got Azorius Yorion Blink. So here's another one that many of times, and I think I've seen it hit in the top 10, maybe top 1 a few times already. Very important. Runs a similar style, except it's going to 80 with Yorion as the companion instead of 4 in the main board, which is important to keep in mind. So here's what we got going on. It all revolves around different blink opportunities. Lots more in terms of what I would say mechanics versus the Selesnya Yorion one, but then again, it's not as narrow of a path because you have so many more cards that you can hit. And then the sideboard is really focused in terms of additional control kind of a thing. All right. Finally, rounding out the Tier 1, we got a Dimmer Rogues deck. This is a particular version that I think I ran here that I really enjoy. I think the other one might have some of the Slither Wisps in there and has a little bit more of a flash, which is also a really great one. A lot of good mechanics. This particular one runs Zareth, Sam the Trickster, and then here's the sideboard for you as well. This deck has maintained its pace at being a top deck for a while, and also is, in my opinion, from what I know of the meta, a larger share of the meta. So being versed in terms of having a deck that either you're playing this one, or if you know that you're most likely going to play against it, having some sort of graveyard access with things like Escape is going to be really important for you. Next, we got Gruul Adventures. So this was a top 8 deck coming out of the the Magic 2020 finals, piloted by both Emma and Autumn. Still on pace, on track to do a lot of great things. Here's the sideboard as well. Very, very competitive, very, very fast, very, very quick in terms of picking things off. It's also going to run well against the enchantment decks, as well as the ability to take off artifacts. So very competitive against the Yorion decks as well. Next, in tier 2, we got Esper Doom. So Esper's been definitely climbing up the ladder. This particular one, Confounding Conundrums, like a cheaper, well, not a cheaper, but an additional Omen of the Sea. We don't have to worry about landfall as much. You can still run into it, but really relying on Dance of the Manse here, Control, Skyclave Apparition, and then our favorite Doom Foretold, and then also an Ashiok in there for additional spice. This particular one also runs Dream Trawler, and then our Typhoons. So lots of great things happening. A really, really good deck in terms of the broader meta. A lot of ability to control the match and run really well. Here's the sideboard for you as well. All right. Next, in tier 2, we have the Rakdos midrange. So this has been a very popular deck. Very, very strong against some of the aggro decks. Puts up really, really good results relatively quickly. The discard is extremely painful. The ability, again, kind of similar with the Dimmer Control, having access to your graveyard. This matchup against Dimmer Control, this one's typically favored from what I've seen, because again, the additional access here with Kroxa makes a huge difference, and can be very problematic for the rogue decks as well as other mill. And then we have a lot of great sideboard options too. Next, we got mono red. So before, this one was a little bit further down. I think it's gotten much better, partly due to the Omnath ban, partly due to an opening, aggressive opening in the space right out the bat as well, particularly, again, best of 3, because that is what we're talking about, to keep in mind. And then, again, this was an early version deck that I enjoy running. I really like Fur of the Bitten. Lots of good things that we can do here, put up some damage, get some good results as well. And here's the sideboard for this one. All right, next, mono green. So this deck is not the food deck, that is on my list, but still a very, very powerful deck here. Definitely the stompy version. And still fairly aggressive. It is very hard for opponents, particularly mono red, to deal with a mono green deck like this, because things get pretty big and can get pretty hard to deal with as well. All right, and then here's the sideboard. All right, next we have mono white artifacts, or auras, as we like to call it. More so auras. We got a lot going on here. This deck has began to put up some really, really good results. I've seen this a few times now in the top hundreds. Very, very efficient at taking down a lot of things. Also, the ability to have these protections and not necessarily get targeted becomes a big deal. We also have access to a great sideboard that allows us to shut a lot of things down. And then also, for some reason, Luris didn't stick there. So there we go. We got Luris over there as well. Next, we have... Uh-oh, I moved it. It screwed my list up. You guys got to see that real time at least. All right, next we have Boros Your Cycling. That is the problem with doing these things sometimes. So here we go. Great access. I've seen this not run Luris as well now, but very efficient. If you play it like the old Boros, you're going to be in a good position. Things to keep in mind. And then additionally here, we got access to 4 different colors with the modal lands, which makes this really important. And then in terms of a sideboard, we got a lot of great options for the meta there too. All right, mono white aggro. So this became very popular again towards right before the ban. Has still been steadily playing very well. It is a great deck. It is an aggressive deck. It does fall down a lot to the instant death, which is kind of why it's in the middle here in terms of the middle of the pack, obviously, for the tier 2 stuff. Here's the sideboard as well. Lots of good options for you there. All right. Next, that brings us to Golgari Adventures. So this one, again, is a tier 2, middle of the pack. It started out strong, was very popular. Unfortunately, in some of the recent tournaments, it did not quite put up the results that we were expecting, which makes a big difference here. So next, let's go ahead and look at what we got going on. Again, that access to Edgewell is a big deal. It makes a difference for us, so we just have to pay attention to that. And then we do have access to Scavenging Ooze, which helps against the mill decks. Lots of big powerful creatures, and then Pull a Chronos is amazing. This card is so nasty. And then we got the sideboard options here as well. All right, and then last in our tier 2, we have Dimir Lurrus Mill. So I really enjoy this deck. It's a lot of fun. We got a lot going on. In particular, I like Lull Mage Domination. I think this is great. It's nice to have main board, obviously for a lot of heavy creature-based decks, but really driving home these low casting costs here that put up a lot of good results. And then obviously we got great things in the sideboard as well to deal with a lot of different situations in a broader range in terms of the meta. Next, in tier 3 starting, we have Naya Winata. So I really enjoy this deck. It's really interesting. It takes a little bit more to get going, which is one of the reasons, in my opinion, it's a tier 3. The consistency is harder to obtain, but obviously with more plays and knowing what to keep, when to keep, and then hitting the right kind of mana base, could easily make it a very nice deck for you, or move it up in the tiers. And then here again is access to that sideboard. Next, we got Grixis Lurrus. So this was the most recent deck. Really enjoyed this. I did put this in tier 3. I think it has the ability to be optimized still a little bit. I know I got a lot of questions about the one-ofs, but I really like that in terms of the situation for the things that we have going on here as well. Lots of cool components. I like this a little bit better than the mid-range deck. I think there's some room to grow in this space still, and obviously with the evolving meta, this could be one to keep an eye on as well. Here's the sideboard, so let's keep an eye on this. Next, we have Selesnya Counters. So this deck could also be a breakout deck, in my opinion. I've seen it run very well when it was more of the mid-rangey type stuff, but we've seen a little bit of collapse in that space. It's got a lot of vulnerabilities to it, but it also has a lot of upside once things get moving. If you get moving, it's hard to shut it off. Here is the sideboard for you as well. All right, is it Tempo? I've been playing a few more of these lately again. I really like this deck. I think it's a very smooth deck, and fairly straightforward to play. Awesome components, lots of things that we can do. I love Magmatic Chandler. I think this one has some good options as well, and good opportunities potentially again to do better depending on what happens in the meta. Next, we got Orzhov Aggro. I think there's a number of different kinds of these out here. This is just one particular version. I think it could be a little bit more tight or tightened up in terms of the deck, but always good to have room to grow, which allows us to find an ever-evolving meta, as we discussed, and I think it's a great fun deck to play with a lot of good options as well. And here's the sideboard for you. And last but not least, to round it all out, we have Jeskai spells. So this particular deck was more so about access to Vadrock, Apex of Thunder. I do think there are some other areas it does run Seagate Stormcrawler, which again I think is a sleeper card and has a lot of ability and a lot of room to grow. I think this could be tweaked a little bit more with leveraging the splashing for planes for some other goodies potentially in the future. So this one's another one that we could keep an eye on. Lots of good access here in terms of the sideboard as well. Very, very excited about that. All right, Planeswalkers, that rounds out the list for us. And obviously this is not a T1, it's snuck in there for us today. So if you do have questions or comments, please let me know down below. The deck lists are available for you down below. Access to all this content on my channel. So please feel free to subscribe down over there. Additionally, you can like the video if you like it. You can like me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter and Twitch. Stay up to date on content like this. Planeswalkers, I think you're going to enjoy this. Again, I think we're at a very, very healthy state when it comes to the meta. I'm very excited about this. Look forward to this weekend, as I said, to see some of these additional results. Nonetheless, you folks and Planeswalkers, you stay tuned. You take care. You stay safe. We'll see you again soon. We talked about the tier list. We talked about observations. We talked about each of these decks at a high level. Obviously, you have access to them, like I said, for deeper dives and gameplay. So looking forward to seeing you again soon. Take care. Mithras out. Stay safe.